My name is Elena Moretti. For 26 years, I was the invisible ingredient in my father's Michelin-starred empire. I sweated over the stoves while my brother, Marco, collected the praise in the dining room. They told me a woman's place was in the kitchen, but only as a servant, never as the owner. When I asked for my rightful place, they didn't just deny me, they erased me. They fired me from the very legacy I built with my own blood and sweat. But what they didn't realize is that once you take everything from a woman who has nothing left to lose, she becomes the most dangerous person in the room. I've spent the last 7 years perfecting a recipe they never saw coming: the total destruction of the Moretti name. The heat in the kitchen of Loro di Napoli was a living thing. It was a humid, suffocating beast that roared with the sound of high-pressure gas burners and the rhythmic clattering of stainless steel. To anyone else, it was a nightmare. To me, it was home. I stood at the pass, the command center of the kitchen, checking every plate that went out. My eyes were sharp, scanning for a stray drop of oil on a rim or a micro-herb that wasn't perfectly placed. Table 12, the risotto is oversalted, I snapped, sliding a copper pan back toward the saucier. Start again. We have a reputation, and I won't have it dragged down because you're tired. We have 30 more covers before the rush ends. Move! Yes, chef, the young man shouted, his face flushed red from the steam.
I was 26 years old, and I was the heartbeat of this restaurant. My father, Marcello Moretti, was the face. He was the one who walked through the dining room in his crisp white jacket, sipping wine with celebrities and shaking hands with critics. But I was the one who arrived at 5 a.m. to meet the fishmongers. I was the one who spent 3 months perfecting the fermentation process for our signature sourdough. I was the one who managed the temperamental line cooks and the razor-thin margins. My brother, Marco, was usually nowhere to be found until the important guests arrived. Marco was 3 years older and lived his life in the gossip columns. He was Executive Vice President of Brand Relations, a title my father had invented so Marco could have a business card that looked impressive while he spent the company's marketing budget on champagne for his friends. As the clock struck 11 p.m., the final orders were cleared. I felt the usual ache in my lower back and the familiar sting of a fresh steam burn on my forearm. I was exhausted, but I was proud. Today was the day. My father had promised that on the restaurant's 10th anniversary, we would discuss the future of the Moretti Group. "Elena," a voice boomed from the back of the kitchen. My father stood in the doorway of his office. He wasn't wearing his chef's coat anymore. He was in a charcoal-colored Armani suit. Beside him stood Marco, looking smug, his hands tucked into his pockets. "In my office, now," my father commanded. I wiped my brow with my sleeve and followed them. The office was a sanctuary of old-world wealth, dark oak walls, leather-bound books, and the smell of expensive cigars. It was a jarring contrast to the frantic, sterile white of the kitchen I had just left. "Elena, sit down," Marcello said, gesturing to a low chair. He remained standing, leaning against his desk like a judge delivering a verdict. Marco took the seat behind the desk, my father's seat. My heart skipped a beat. "We have reached a milestone," my father began, his voice deep and formal. "The Moretti Group is no longer a small family business. With our 3 locations in New York and the new opening in Miami, we are a global brand. This requires a specific kind of leadership, a figurehead who can command respect in the boardroom and negotiate with the titans of industry." I smiled, feeling a surge of hope. "I agree, Dad. I've already drafted the expansion plan for the Chicago market. If we optimize the supply chain—" "Elena, stop," Marco interrupted, his voice dripping with mock pity. "You're thinking like a cook. We're talking about vision." My father cleared his throat. I have decided to name Marco as the sole heir and CEO of the Moretti Group. He will hold 100% of the voting shares. The paperwork has already been filed with the lawyers this afternoon." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I had been punched in the solar plexus. Marco? Sole heir? Dad, Marco doesn't know the first thing about the operations. He doesn't know our food costs, he doesn't know our staff, he doesn't even know how to read a P&L statement without help. "He has the Moretti name," he barked. "And he is a man. In this industry, the big investors, the landlords, the bank presidents, they want to talk to a man. They don't want to negotiate with a girl who spent her afternoon deveining shrimp. It's about optics, Elena. It's about the legacy of the Moretti patriarch." "The patriarch?" I stood up, my voice trembling with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "I am the one who kept this business afloat when you were sick 3 years ago. I am the one who earned the second Michelin star that tripled our valuation. Marco was in Ibiza while I was working 20-hour days to make sure we didn't lose the lease." Marco leaned back in the chair, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "And we appreciate your service, Elena. Really, we do. That's why, under my new leadership, I'm keeping you as the executive chef of this location. However, since we need to cut costs to fund my new lifestyle branding initiative, we're going to have to adjust your compensation. You'll be taking a 40% pay cut. Your family, after all. You should be happy to sacrifice for the greater good of the Moretti name." A pay cut? I looked at my father, begging him with my eyes to say something, to tell me it was a joke, to show a single spark of the man who used to teach me how to make pasta when I was 5. Marcello avoided my gaze. "It's a business decision, Elena. You should be grateful. Most women would kill to have a head chef position in a kitchen like this. Just stay in the back, keep the food consistent, and let Marco handle the world." The betrayal was so cold, it felt like ice in my veins. They didn't see me as a partner. They didn't even see me as a daughter. I was a tool, an appliance, something to be used until it was no longer convenient. "I won't do it," I said, my voice suddenly reaching a level of calm that surprised even me. "Excuse me?" Marco laughed. "What won't you do? You have nowhere else to go. We own your reputation. If you leave, I'll make sure every critic in this city knows you were unstable and emotional. You'll be lucky to get a job at a diner in Jersey." I looked at the 2 men across from me. My father, blinded by an archaic sense of masculine legacy, and my brother, a parasite who had finally found a host. "You think the Moretti name is what makes this place special?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The name is just letters on a sign. I am the flavor. I am the soul of the food. Without me, this isn't Loro di Napoli. It's just an overpriced museum for your egos." I reached for the buttons of my chef's coat. One by one, I undid them. I pulled the heavy white garment off and dropped it on the floor. "Elena, don't be a child," my father hissed. "Pick that up." "No," I said. "You want a man's lead? You want Marco to be the face? Then let him cook. Let him manage the line. Let him explain to the regulars why the food tastes like ash tomorrow night." I turned to the door, but Marco's voice stopped me. "Oh, and, Elena, don't bother looking for that trust fund Grandma left you. Dad signed over the guardianship of those assets to me as part of the succession. It's being reinvested into my new penthouse. Think of it as your contribution to the brand's image." I froze. That money was my only safety net. They hadn't just fired me, they had robbed me. They wanted to ensure I was so broken, so destitute, that I would eventually crawl back and beg for my job back at half the pay. I didn't turn around. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing the tears that were threatening to spill. 7 years, I said, loud enough for them to hear. "What was that?" Marco sneered. It took you 10 years to build this empire, Dad. I give you 7 years to destroy it. Marco will bleed this company dry with his vanity. He'll alienate the staff. He'll cheapen the ingredients. He'll lose the stars. And when you're standing in the middle of a bankrupt kitchen wondering where it all went wrong, remember this night. Get out, my father roared. I walked out of the office, through the kitchen where the prep cooks stopped and stared at their former leader walking out in her t-shirt, and into the cool New York night. I had no coat, I had no money, I had no family. I walked 20 blocks in the rain until I reached a small, cramped apartment in Brooklyn that I shared with 2 roommates. I sat on my twin bed and pulled out a small, battered notebook from my bag. It wasn't a cookbook. It was a ledger of every contact, every secret supplier, and every investor who had ever whispered to me that they preferred my management style to my father's. I opened my laptop. My bank account showed exactly $412. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened a new document and typed 3 words at the top. Project Phoenix. Beneath it, I wrote, Step 1, disappear. Step 2, kill Elena Moretti. Step 3, build the ghost. My father was right about one thing. The world didn't want to negotiate with a girl who deveined shrimp, so I wouldn't be a girl. I would be a shadow. I would be a silent entity, a force of nature that moved through the industry like a ghost. I looked at my scarred hands, red from the kitchen heat and shaking from the adrenaline of shock. You want a man's world, Dad? I whispered to the dark room. I'm going to build a new one, and then I'm going to use it to crush yours. That night, Elena Moretti died. In her place, a woman with no name and a heart of flint began to cook a very different kind of meal. The prep work would take years, the seasoning would be subtle, but the final course would be a masterpiece of absolute ruin.
The first year was not about cooking. It was about survival and erasure. To the world, Elena Moretti had vanished. I moved to a part of Queens where the subway screeched loud enough to drown out my thoughts and took a job under the name Lena Ward. I wasn't a chef anymore. I was a night shift line cook in a high-volume, greasy diner near the industrial docks. It was a place where no food critic would ever set foot, and no member of the Moretti family would ever be caught dead. The work was brutal, soul-crushing, and anonymous, but it was perfect. I needed to disconnect my face from the Moretti brand. I cut my long, dark hair into a jagged blonde pixie style and traded my tailored chef's whites for stained aprons and heavy work boots. Every night, as I flipped burgers and poached eggs for truckers and dock workers, I listened, I read, I studied the movements of the market. While I was scraping grease off a flat-top grill at 4 a.m., Marco was making his first major moves. I kept track of him through a burner phone, scrolling through industry newsletters. 6 months in, he made the mistake I had predicted. He fired the Moretti Group's longtime vegetable supplier, a small family farm in upstate New York, and replaced them with a massive industrial conglomerate to optimize the bottom line. I felt a pang of sadness for the farmers, but a spark of cold joy for my plan. That supplier was the secret to our signature sauces. Without their heirloom tomatoes, L'Oro di Napoli was just another Italian restaurant with expensive curtains. By the second year, I had saved enough to make my move. I didn't open a restaurant. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I founded a shell company called Aletheia Holdings. I hired a sharp young law student named Julian, who was looking for a way to pay off his loans. He was my voice. To the world, Aletheia was a private equity firm backed by overseas investors. In reality, it was just me, sitting in a cold room with a laptop and a vision. I started small.
I began buying up the debt of the companies that supplied the Moretti Group. When Marco fell behind on payments to the linen company or the wine distributors, which he frequently did because he was spending the cash flow on promotional parties, Aletheia Holdings was there to buy those invoices. I wasn't just a ghost. I was becoming their landlord, their creditor, and their silent shadow. One rainy Tuesday in 2021, Julian called me. "The Miami location is struggling, Lena. Marco over-leveraged the property to buy a yacht. The bank is looking to sell the mezzanine debt." "Buy it," I said, staring at the map of Manhattan pinned to my wall. "Buy every cent of it, but keep our name out of the papers. If the Morettis find out who is holding their leash, they'll stop bleeding. We need them to keep bleeding." The beauty of Marco's arrogance was his predictability. He thought he was a genius because the restaurants were still full. He didn't realize that people were coming because of the reputation I had built, a reputation that was slowly eroding. The first blow came in late 2021. L'Oro di Napoli lost its second Michelin star. The review was devastating. "The soul of the kitchen seems to have departed," the critic wrote. "What was once a masterpiece of nuance is now a loud, salty caricature of its former self. The service is flashy, but the plate is empty." I sat in my diner booth reading the review over a cup of black coffee. I could almost hear my father screaming in his office. I could imagine Marco blaming the kitchen staff, firing people in a fit of rage, never once looking in the mirror. "Step 1 complete," I whispered. Then I used the leverage from the Miami debt to force a meeting, not with the Morettis, but with their primary silent investor, a man named Silas Thorne. Silas was a shark who only cared about returns. He was tired of Marco's branding expenses. Julian met him in a high-rise office. I sat in the car downstairs, listening through a hidden microphone. "Who is your principal?" Silas asked, his voice skeptical. "Why does this Aletheia Group want to buy out my position in the Moretti Group?" "My principal believes that the current management is incompetent. We believe the brand is being devalued. We want to take over the debt and eventually the assets. You get a 20% premium on your exit today. No more headaches with Marco Moretti." The beauty of Marco's arrogance was his predictability. He thought he was a genius because the restaurants were still full. He didn't realize that people were coming because of the reputation I had built, a reputation that was slowly eroding. The first blow came in late 2021. L'Oro di Napoli lost its second Michelin star. The review was devastating. "The soul of the kitchen seems to have departed," the critic wrote. "What was once a masterpiece of nuance is now a loud, salty caricature of its former self. The service is flashy, but the plate is empty." I sat in my diner booth reading the review over a cup of black coffee. I could almost hear my father screaming in his office. I could imagine Marco blaming the kitchen staff, firing people in a fit of rage, never once looking in the mirror. "Step 1 complete," I whispered. Then I used the leverage from the Miami debt to force a meeting, not with the Morettis, but with their primary silent investor, a man named Silas Thorne. Silas was a shark who only cared about returns. He was tired of Marco's branding expenses. Julian met him in a high-rise office. I sat in the car downstairs, listening through a hidden microphone. "Who is your principal?" Silas asked, his voice skeptical. "Why does this Aletheia Group want to buy out my position in the Moretti Group?" "My principal believes that the current management is incompetent. We believe the brand is being devalued. We want to take over the debt and eventually the assets. You get a 20% premium on your exit today. No more headaches with Marco Moretti." The beauty of Marco's arrogance was his predictability. He thought he was a genius because the restaurants were still full. He didn't realize that people were coming because of the reputation I had built, a reputation that was slowly eroding. The first blow came in late 2021. L'Oro di Napoli lost its second Michelin star. The review was devastating. The soul of the kitchen seems to have departed, the critic wrote. What was once a masterpiece of nuance is now a loud, salty caricature of its former self. The service is flashy, but the plate is empty. I sat in my diner booth reading the review over a cup of black coffee. I could almost hear my father screaming in his office. I could imagine Marco blaming the kitchen staff, firing people in a fit of rage, never once looking in the mirror. "Step 1 complete," I whispered. Then I used the leverage from the Miami debt to force a meeting, not with the Morettis, but with their primary silent investor, a man named Silas Thorne. Silas was a shark who only cared about returns. He was tired of Marco's branding expenses. Julian met him in a high-rise office. I sat in the car downstairs, listening through a hidden microphone. "Who is your principal?" Silas asked, his voice skeptical. "Why does this Aletheia group want to buy out my position in the Moretti group?" "My principal believes that the current management is incompetent. We believe the brand is being devalued. We want to take over the debt and eventually the assets. You get a 20% premium on your exit today. No more headaches with Marco Moretti." The beauty of Marco's arrogance was his predictability. He thought he was a genius because the restaurants were still full. He didn't realize that people were coming because of the reputation I had built, a reputation that was slowly eroding. The first blow came in late 2021. L'Oro di Napoli lost its second Michelin star. The review was devastating. The soul of the kitchen seems to have departed, the critic wrote. What was once a masterpiece of nuance is now a loud, salty caricature of its former self. The service is flashy, but the plate is empty. I sat in my diner booth reading the review over a cup of black coffee. I could almost hear my father screaming in his office. I could imagine Marco blaming the kitchen staff, firing people in a fit of rage, never once looking in the mirror. "Step 1 complete," I whispered. Then I used the leverage from the Miami debt to force a meeting, not with the Morettis, but with their primary silent investor, a man named Silas Thorne. Silas was a shark who only cared about returns. He was tired of Marco's branding expenses. Julian met him in a high-rise office. I sat in the car downstairs, listening through a hidden microphone. "Who is your principal?" Silas asked, his voice skeptical. "Why does this Aletheia group want to buy out my position in the Moretti group?" "My principal believes that the current management is incompetent. We believe the brand is being devalued. We want to take over the debt and eventually the assets. You get a 20% premium on your exit today."
By the 5th year, the Moretti Group was no longer an empire. It was a sinking ship, and Marco was trying to bail out the ocean with a silver spoon. He had replaced my disciplined, hand-picked kitchen crew with cheap, inexperienced labor. The result was a string of health code violations and a public relations nightmare involving a salmonella outbreak that made the front page of the New York Post. I watched it all from my office in Brooklyn, a clean, minimalist space that overlooked the harbor. I was no longer the girl in the stained apron. I wore sharp, tailored suits and kept my hair in that icy blonde pixie cut. I looked like a stranger, even to myself. "Julian," I said, leaning back in my chair as I looked at the latest financial reports, "tell me about the default notices." Julian, now my most trusted lieutenant, smiled. "It's beautiful, Lena. Marco missed the balloon payment on the Manhattan flagship's mortgage. Because Aletheia Holdings bought the debt from the original bank last year, we are now the primary lien holder. We have the legal right to foreclose on L'Oro di Napoli within 30 days. "And my father?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. Marcello is desperate. He's been trying to liquidate his personal art collection to cover the interest, but it's not enough. Marco has been hiding the true extent of the losses from Marcello, but the secret is out now. They've reached out to every major venture capital firm in the city looking for a bailout. And let me guess, I interjected, no one is biting. Exactly. The Moretti name is toxic now, except for one potential savior. Julian paused, his eyes gleaming. They've requested a meeting with the board of Alethea Holdings. They think we're just another faceless private equity firm looking for a distressed asset to flip. They have no idea they're walking into a lion's den. The meeting was set for the following Monday. I decided I wasn't ready to show my face yet. I wanted them to suffer in the uncertainty a little longer. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own incompetence pressing down on them. "Send the term sheet," I commanded. "Make it predatory. Demand a 51% stake in the entire group in exchange for a debt restructuring. If they want to save the Moretti legacy, they have to give up control of it." The reaction was immediate. Marco called Julian screaming, threatening lawsuits, claiming that the Moretti name was worth 10 times what we were offering. But by Friday, the screaming turned to begging. They had no other options. The payroll for the upcoming month was due, and the accounts were empty. While they scrambled, I focused on Nostos, my shadow restaurant. It had moved from a dark kitchen to a secret invite-only location in a refurbished warehouse. There were no signs, no menus, and no publicity. You had to know someone to get a table. The elite of New York, the very people my father used to court, were now lining up to eat my food, unaware that the chef of shadows was the daughter they had discarded. I spent my nights in that kitchen, hidden behind a frosted glass partition, cooking the recipes that were my birthright. I used the ingredients Marco deemed too expensive: the hand-pressed olive oil from a specific grove in Tuscany, the sea salt harvested from the coast of Sicily, the milk-fed veal from the farm Marco had fired. One night, a reservation came in that made my heart stop. Silas Thorne, the investor who had sold his shares to me years ago. He was coming to Nostos with a guest. I cooked for him with a ferocity I hadn't felt in years. I prepared a deconstructed osso buco that melted on the tongue, followed by a lemon tart that tasted like a summer morning in Sorrento. After the meal, Silas asked to speak to the chef. I stayed behind the frosted glass, my silhouette the only thing visible to him. "I don't know who you are," Silas said, his voice echoing in the quiet dining room, "but I've been eating at L'Oro di Napoli for 20 years. I thought the soul of that place died when the daughter left, but I was wrong. It didn't die, it moved. You have the same hands, chef, the same spirit." I didn't say a word. I just bowed my head slightly. "If you're who I think you are," Silas whispered, "just know that the Morettis are finished. They're coming to your firm on Monday to sign away their souls. They think they're saving the family name, but they're just handing you the shovel to bury them." Monday morning arrived, cold and gray. I sat in the observation room of the Alethea boardroom, watching through a one-way mirror. My father walked in first. He looked like a ghost of the man I remembered. His suit hung loose on his frame, and his once boisterous walk had become a hesitant shuffle. Marco followed, looking disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He was still wearing his expensive watch and his designer shoes, clinging to the trappings of wealth that no longer existed. Julian sat at the head of the table. "Gentlemen," he said, sliding a thick stack of documents across the table, "you've reviewed the terms. 51% of the Moretti Group transfers to Alethea immediately. In return, we settle the outstanding debts and provide a $5 million credit line for operations." "This is theft," Marco spat, his voice cracking. 51%! You're taking our family's life work for a pittance. Marco, sit down, Marcello whispered. He looked at Julian. Who is behind this firm? I won't sign my life away to a ghost. I want to meet the person who is buying my name. My principal will meet you once the ink is dry, Mr. Moretti. Right now, you have 10 minutes before the foreclosure filing becomes public record. Sign or lose everything today. I watched my father's hand shake as he picked up the pen. He looked at Marco, who was staring at the floor in a fit of silent rage. With a heavy sigh, Marcello signed the paper. Marco followed, scrawling his name with a jagged, angry stroke. It's done, Julian said, picking up the documents. The Moretti Group now belongs to Alethea Holdings. Now, my father said, his voice trembling, bring out your boss. I want to see the man who beat me. Julian looked at the one-way mirror and nodded. I stood up, smoothed my suit, and walked toward the door. The 7 years were almost up. The debt was collected. Now it was time for the final service. The heavy oak door of the boardroom clicked open with a sound that felt like a guillotine blade dropping. I stepped into the room, the heels of my designer pumps echoing against the marble floor. The silence was absolute. My father was looking at his hands, his head bowed in the posture of a man who had just surrendered his kingdom. Marco was staring out the window, his jaw tight. Neither of them looked up immediately, assuming another anonymous lawyer or executive had entered to finalize the humiliation. You wanted to meet the man who beat you, Dad? I said, my voice cutting through the air like a chilled blade. I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. Both heads snapped toward me. Marcello's eyes widened, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. He blinked, squinting through his spectacles as if he were seeing a hallucination. He saw a woman in a sharp navy suit, hair blonde and short, eyes cold and calculating. But beneath the transformation, the bone structure was unmistakable. "Elena?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, that's not possible." Marco stood up so fast his chair toppled over. "What the hell is this? What are you doing here, Elena? Are you working for these people? Did you leak our trade secrets to them?" I walked to the head of the table, the seat Julian had just vacated. I didn't sit. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the polished wood, looking directly at my brother. "I don't work for Alethea Holdings, Marco," I said, a small, dark smile playing on my lips. "I am Alethea Holdings. Every debt you failed to pay, every supplier you insulted, every bank you lied to, I was there. I bought your mistakes. I've been your landlord for 3 years. I've been your primary creditor for 2. And as of 10 minutes ago, I am your boss." You sabotaged us!" Marco screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. "Dad, she's been plotting this! This is illegal! This is corporate espionage!" "Sabotage?" I laughed, and the sound was hollow. "I didn't have to lift a finger to sabotage you, Marco. I just watched. I watched you replace our organic produce with frozen waste. I watched you spend the payroll tax money on a penthouse in Soho. I watched you treat our Michelin-starred staff like disposable trash until they all quit and came to work for me. You destroyed this empire all by yourself. I just made sure I was the one holding the net when it fell." My father finally stood up, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table. "Elena, why? We are your family, your own blood." "Blood?" I turned my gaze to him, and the coldness in my eyes made him flinch. "You stood in that office 7 years ago and told me I was the help. You told me a woman's place was in the kitchen, but only if she stayed quiet and did the work for a man's glory.
You let this parasite, I gestured to Marco, steal my inheritance and my reputation. You didn't treat me like blood, Marcello. You treated me like an ingredient you could discard when the recipe changed. We gave you everything, Marcello shouted, his old fire flickering for a second before dying out. You gave me a scarred hand and a broken heart, and then you gave me the motivation to become better than you ever were. While you were losing your stars, I was building Nostos. While you were begging for loans, I was becoming the person you had to beg. Marco lunged toward the table, reaching for the signed documents. This contract is void. It was signed under false pretenses. We didn't know it was you. Julian stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the documents. The contract is with Alethea Holdings, a legal entity. The identity of the principal is irrelevant to the validity of the debt. You signed it, Marco, in front of witnesses and a notary. It's over. I sat down in the CEO's chair, the seat my father had occupied for 40 years. It felt cold. Here is what happens next, I said, my voice dropping to a businesslike monotone. The Moretti Group is undergoing an immediate restructuring. Marco, you are fired, effective immediately. Security is already at your office packing your things. You are banned from all Moretti properties. If you show your face at Loro di Napoli, you will be arrested for trespassing. You can't fire me, Marco wailed. Dad, tell her. Marcella looked at his son, then at me. For the first time, I saw a flash of realization in his eyes. He saw the strength he had always claimed I lacked. He saw the Moretti steel, but it wasn't in the son he had pampered. It was in the daughter he had betrayed. I can't tell her anything, Marco, Marcello whispered, sinking back into his chair. She owns the chair now. And as for you, Dad, I continued, leaning back, crossing my legs, you will retain a title of founder emeritus. You will have no voting rights, no office, and no say in the menu. You will receive a pension that is exactly 30% less than your previous salary. Consider it a lesson in humility, as Marco once put it. I leaned back, crossing my legs. The restaurants will be closed for 1 month. We are stripping the lifestyle branding. We are bringing back the old suppliers. We are rehiring the staff Marco fired. And most importantly, we are changing the name. The Moretti Group is dead. From now on, the company will be known as the Elena Collection. Marco looked like he was about to have a stroke. Marcello just stared at the table, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. Now, I said, gesturing toward the door, get out of my boardroom. I have a star to win back. As they shuffled out, Marco still cursing under his breath, my father leaning heavily on his cane, I felt a strange sensation. I expected to feel a rush of joy, a grand sense of victory, but all I felt was the quiet, sterile peace of a job well done. The 7 years were up. The debt was paid in full. I looked at Julian. Call the kitchen, tell the ghost is coming home, and tell the fishmonger I want the best catch he's had in a decade. We have work to do.
The day after the takeover, I didn't go to the corporate office. I went to the kitchen of Loro di Napoli. I arrived at 4 a.m. just as I used to, but this time I wasn't in a chef's jacket. I was in a black silk blouse and tailored trousers, holding a clipboard that felt like a weapon. I walked into the walk-in freezer. It was a disaster. Under Marco's optimization, the high-grade Wagyu had been replaced by choice-cut beef from a local wholesaler. The organic herbs were wilted. The shelves were sticky. It smelled like neglect. Empty it, I said to the skeletal crew that had remained. Chef,
I mean, Miss Moretti, this is $50,000 worth of inventory, the kitchen manager stammered. This isn't food, I replied, tossing a bag of pre-peeled garlic into a trash bin. This is evidence of a crime. Throw it all away, every scrap. If it didn't come from a farm I've personally visited, it doesn't belong in my kitchen. By noon, the dumpster behind the restaurant was overflowing with the mediocrity Marco had curated. I spent the afternoon in the dining room, watching the branding experts Marco had hired try to justify their existence. They had filled the restaurant with velvet ropes, neon signs, and gold-plated salt shakers. Everything goes, I told the decorators. The neon, the velvet, the overpriced art. We are a restaurant, not a nightclub for people who hate food. I want white linens, I want copper pots, and I want the smell of roasting garlic and fresh rosemary to be the only decoration we need. While the physical space was being purged, the legal battle began. Marco, true to his nature, didn't go quietly. Within 48 hours, he had filed a lawsuit claiming duress and tortious interference. He went on every morning talk show that would have him, playing the victim, claiming that his vengeful sister had manipulated an old, sick man into signing away his legacy. I sat in my new office, my father's old office, watching a clip of him on a plasma screen. He looked pathetic, squeezing out fake tears for the cameras. "Lena," Julian said, entering the room. "The press is hounding us. They want a statement. The headline in the Times is, 'Moretti Family Feud, the daughter who stole the crown.'" "Let them talk," I said, not taking my eyes off the screen. "In this industry, there is only one statement that matters, and you can't print it in a newspaper. You have to taste it." "But the investors are nervous. Marco is telling them that you're going to liquidate the assets and disappear. He's trying to trigger a key man clause in some of the older contracts." I turned the TV off. Marco doesn't realize that the key man in this company hasn't been him for a long time. Invite the top 10 investors to a private dinner at the restaurant this Friday. Tell them the new CEO will be cooking for them personally. If they aren't convinced by the dessert, I'll hand them back their shares for free. Friday night arrived. The restaurant was still a construction zone, but I had cleared a single table in the center of the darkened dining room. I had spent the entire day in the kitchen, alone. My hands, which had become soft during my years as a ghost investor, were once again covered in flour and blackened by the flame. As the investors arrived, 10 men and women who controlled the capital of the city, they looked uncomfortable. They had to walk past piles of discarded velvet and broken neon signs. They were expecting a corporate presentation. Instead, they found me, dressed in my old, stained chef coat, standing by a stove I had dragged into the dining room. "Tonight," my voice steady despite the adrenaline, "you're not here to look at spreadsheets. You're here to remember why you invested in the Moretti name in the first place. You didn't do it for Marco's parties. You did it for the food, and for 7 years, you haven't had a single bite of it." I served them 5 courses. Each one was a memory. The first was a simple crudo of scallops that tasted like the cold Atlantic. The second was a raviolo with a single golden egg yolk inside that burst like a sun. As they ate, the room went silent. These were people who could afford anything, but they hadn't been able to buy this. I saw Silas Thorne at the end of the table. He took a bite of the lamb and closed his eyes. "This is it," he whispered. "The star is back." After the meal, I stood before them. "My brother is suing me. My father is mourning a son who doesn't exist, but I am here. This company is now debt-free, and our food cost is going up because I refuse to serve garbage. Your dividends might be lower this quarter, but the value of your shares just doubled because people will wait 6 months for a table at this restaurant." "What about Marco's lawsuit?" one woman asked. "Marco signed those papers in front of a notary while sober,
And more importantly, I have a recorded confession of him bragging about using company funds for his personal debts, a conversation I recorded through a ghost phone 3 years ago. If he continues this lawsuit, I won't just fire him, I'll send him to prison for embezzlement. The room went quiet. I saw the investors look at each other. One by one, they nodded. "The lawsuit will be dropped by Monday," Silas said. "I'll make sure of it. Marco is a liability. You, Elena, you are an asset." As they left, I felt a shadow in the doorway. It was my father. He had been watching from the shadows of the bar. He walked towards me, his cane clicking on the floor. "That was your grandmother's recipe for the ravioli," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't tasted it like that in 20 years. Not even I could get the dough that thin." "I practiced," I said, not looking at him. "While Marco was at the clubs, I was in a basement in Queens, practicing." Marcello sighed, a long, weary sound. "I was wrong, Elena. I thought a leader had to be a lion, loud, aggressive, seen by everyone. I didn't realize that the most powerful thing in the world is the person who makes everyone else better." "I don't want your apology, Dad," I said, finally looking him in the eye. "I just want you to stay out of my kitchen." "I will," he said. He turned to leave, but stopped. "Marco is at the apartment. He's not doing well. He's lost everything." "No," I said, picking up a towel to wipe the counter. "He didn't lose everything. He just finally ran out of other people's things to spend. Good night, Marcello." As he walked away, I realized that the grand cleaning was almost over. The trash was out, the investors were back, the menu was restored. But there was one last piece of the Moretti legacy I hadn't dealt with yet. I looked at my phone. A message from Julian. "Marco is reaching out to the tabloids again. He's going to leak the ghost chef identity of Nastos to claim you were competing against your own father while still a shareholder." I smiled. Let him. I have one more recipe to serve him.
By the beginning of the 6th year, the Elena collection was the most talked about name in the global culinary scene. But as the saying goes, the taller the tree, the stronger the wind. Marco, desperate and humiliated, had finally decided to play his final card, scorched earth. On a Tuesday morning, the New York Gazette ran a front-page exposé. The headline screamed, "The Ghost of Brooklyn Revealed, How Elena Moretti Sabotaged Her Father's Empire from the Shadows." The article was a masterpiece of half-truths. It claimed that while I was still a silent shareholder in the Moretti Group, I had opened a competing dark kitchen, Nostos, to steal customers and devalue the family brand. It portrayed me as a Machiavellian villain who had spent 7 years plotting to bankrupt her own father just to buy him out for pennies on the dollar. "The phones haven't stopped ringing," Julian said, pacing my office. "The culinary board is asking about ethics violations. The Moretti loyalty crowd is calling you a Judas. Even some of the new staff are looking at you differently. Marco really leaned into the betrayed old father angle." I sat at my desk, calmly sipping a glass of water. "Where is Marco now?" "He's doing a live interview with Manhattan Today at 6 p.m. He's planning to call for a boycott of all our restaurants. He's even brought your father along, though Marcello looks like he doesn't know what planet he's on." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Down below, the city was moving, oblivious to the drama. "Julian, call the producer of that show. Tell them I want to appear, live, side by side with my brother." "Elena, that's a trap. He'll scream, he'll lie." "No," I interrupted. "He'll talk, and that's exactly what I want him to do. Gather the files from the 2020 audit, the ones showing the missing $600,000 from the payroll account, and get the footage from the warehouse security cameras from 3 years ago." The studio was cold and smelled of ozone and expensive floor wax. I arrived 10 minutes before the broadcast. I wasn't wearing a chef's coat this time. I wore a white power suit, sharp as a shard of glass. In the green room, I saw them.
My father was sitting in a chair, looking frail, his eyes fixed on the floor. Marco was standing, pacing, looking like a man who had finally found his spotlight again. He was wearing a tie I had bought him for his birthday 10 years ago. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here," Marco hissed as I walked in. "I'm just here to make sure you tell the whole story, Marco," I said softly. "It would be a shame to leave out the best parts." The red light on the camera flickered to life. The host, a sharp-featured woman known for her aggressive interviewing, began the segment. "Tonight we have the Moretti family, a legacy in ruins, a daughter accused of betrayal, and a brother fighting for his name. Elena, your brother says you spent 7 years systematically destroying this company from the inside. What do you have to say?" Marco didn't wait for me to speak. "She's a predator. She opened Nostos to steal our clients. She manipulated debt collectors to haunt our father. She's been a ghost in our lives, waiting for the moment we were most vulnerable to strike." I waited until he was out of breath. Then I turned to the host. "I did open Nostos," I said clearly. "I opened it because after my father and brother fired me for being a woman, I had $400 to my name. I had to cook to eat. And ironically, people preferred the food of a ghost in a basement to the food Marco was serving at Loro di Napoli." "But the debt," the host started. "The debt existed because Marco was stealing from the employees," I said, sliding a folder on the desk. "These are the bank statements from 2020. While I was plotting in my basement, Marco was transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars to an offshore account in the Caymans to pay off his gambling debts. The company wasn't failing because of a ghost, it was failing because its CEO was a thief." The host's eyes went wide. She grabbed the folder. Marco's face went from purple to a ghostly white. That's a lie. Those are forged," Marco stammered. "And this," I said, pointing to the monitor behind us, "is a video from our main warehouse 3 years ago. That's Marco. He personally signed the documents about replacing our premium olive oil with cheap soy mixture, taking the difference in cash from the supplier." The footage played. It was grainy but clear. Marco was laughing, shaking hands with a man who was handing him an envelope. I turned to my father, who was sitting on the end of the panel. "Dad, look at the screen. That's the legacy you chose over me. You said a man had to lead because a woman was too emotional. Is this the masculine authority you were talking about? Fraud, theft, and the destruction of everything you spent 40 years building?" Marcello looked at the screen. He looked at his son. Then he did something I didn't expect. He stood up, unclipped his microphone, and walked off the set without saying a single word to Marco. The silence in the studio was heavy. Marco tried to speak, but he looked like a fish out of water, gasping for air. "I did not destroy the Moretti Group, Marco," I said, looking directly into the camera lens. "I saved it from you. And as for Nostos, I am donating 50% of its future profits to a scholarship fund for women in the culinary arts. Because unlike you, I believe that talent doesn't have a gender. It only has a price, and you just paid yours." I walked off the set before the host could even go to a commercial break. The aftermath was swift. The lawsuit was dropped. The public perception flipped overnight. I wasn't the Judas anymore. I was the vindication. Marco disappeared from public life, hounded by the IRS and the creditors I had finally stopped holding back. But the most important thing happened a week later. I was in the kitchen of the flagship restaurant preparing for the grand reopening. A delivery arrived. It wasn't fish or vegetables. It was a small, dusty box. Inside was my grandmother's original handwritten recipe book, the one my father had kept locked in his safe for decades. There was a note on top in my father's shaky handwriting. "The kitchen was always yours. I was just too blind to see that the flame never goes out, no matter who holds the match. Don't let the soup get cold." I ran my fingers over the weathered pages. I had won. The empire was mine. My brother was gone.
My father was humbled. But as I stood there in the quiet of the morning, I realized that the cold dish of revenge was finished. I was full, and for the first time in 7 years, I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to cook.
By the 7th year, the transformation was complete. The Elena Collection wasn't just a group of restaurants, it was a gold standard. We had regained the 3rd Michelin star for Loro di Napoli, a feat my father had never achieved. My face was on the cover of Forbes and Time. I was no longer a ghost. I was the sun around which the culinary world revolved. But the summit is a lonely place. The higher I climbed, the more I felt the weight of the armor I had built. My office in the sky was beautiful, but it was silent. Julian remained my only true confidant, but even our conversations were dominated by market shares, litigation, and expansion. One evening, while I was reviewing the blueprints for a new opening in Paris, Julian entered with a file that wasn't marked with our corporate seal. "Elena," he said, his voice unusually soft. "There's a situation. It's Marco." I didn't look up from the blueprints. "Unless he's found a way to sue me from the gutter, I'm not interested." "He's in a state-run facility in upstate New York," Julian continued, ignoring my coldness. "He went through the money he hid in the Caymans faster than anyone expected. Gambling, bad investments, and other things. He's sick, Elena. Liver failure. The doctors say he doesn't have much time." I finally looked up. My heart didn't race. It didn't break. It felt like a stone. "And let me guess, he wants money or a miracle." "He hasn't asked for anything," Julian said, ignoring my coldness. "But your father has. Marcello has been spending every day at his bedside. He's begging you to visit. He says Marco wants to apologize." "Apologies are free, Julian," I said, standing up and walking to the window. "But the damage he did cost me 7 years of my life. It cost me my youth. It cost me the ability to trust anyone. Tell my father that I'm busy preparing for the Paris launch." For the next week, I threw myself into work with a feverish intensity. I barked at the sous chefs. I sent back perfectly good ingredients. I was becoming the very thing I had hated, a tyrant who used power as a shield. That Friday, I went to Loro di Napoli for a surprise inspection. I stood in the back of the kitchen, watching the new executive chef, a brilliant woman named Maya whom I had mentored. She was talented, but I saw the way the line cooks flinched when she spoke. I saw the joyless efficiency of the room. It was a mirror of my father's kitchen. I walked to the walk-in freezer, the same place where I had stood 5 years ago to purge Marco's mediocre inventory. I stood in the cold, surrounded by the finest ingredients in the world. I had everything I ever wanted. I had the power, the money, and the name. Then I saw it. Tucked away on a back shelf was a small crate of lemons. They weren't from our primary supplier. I grabbed one and looked at the tag. It was from the small family farm Marco had fired years ago, the one I had promised to reinstate. I walked out to the kitchen holding the lemon. "Maya, who ordered these?" Maya looked nervous. "The supplier said they were a gift, chef, from an old friend of the family. I was going to throw them out since they aren't on the approved list." I looked at the lemon. It was small, slightly scarred, but the scent was intoxicating, the true, sharp, honest smell of the earth. It reminded me of the kitchen table in Naples, where my grandmother taught me that the most important ingredient in any dish isn't salt or fat, it's the intention behind it. I realized then that I had spent 7 years cooking with the intention of winning. I had been feeding my ego, not my soul. I took off my blazer and rolled up my sleeves. "Leave them," I said. "Tonight we're changing the dessert special. We're making Grandma's lemon cake exactly the way she did. No deconstruction, no gold leaf, just the cake." After the service, I drove upstate. The facility was gray and smelled of bleach and despair. I found the room number Julian had given me. My father was sitting in a plastic chair by the bed, his head resting on his cane.
He looked like he had shrunk since I last saw him. On the bed was a man I barely recognized. Marco was yellowed, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling as they rested on the thin white sheet. The executive vice president was gone. The predator was gone. There was only a broken man left. Marcello looked up as I entered. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just reached out and took my hand. His grip was weak, but it was the first time in a decade I felt like his daughter instead of his rival. I walked to the side of the bed. Marco's eyes drifted to me. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rattle. "Elena," he whispered. "The star. You got it back." "I did," I said, my voice low. "I hated you," he said, a single tear leaking from the corner of his eye. "Because I knew you were the one who had it, and I knew I never would. I thought if I took the company, I could steal the talent too. I was a fool." I looked at him, and for the first time in 7 years, the stone in my chest began to crack. I didn't forgive him for what he did. I couldn't. But I saw the misery his choices had brought him. He had spent his life trying to be a king in a kingdom he didn't understand, while I had spent mine building a fortress to keep everyone out. "The lemons arrived, Marco," I said softly. "The ones from the old farm." He managed a tiny, pathetic smile. "They were the best, weren't they?" I admitted. "They were." I stayed for an hour. We didn't talk about the lawsuits or the money. We talked about the sourdough starter we used to play with as children. We talked about the smell of the sea. As I left the room, my father followed me into the hall. "Elena," he said, "what happens now?" I looked at the long, sterile corridor. "Now, Dad, I'm going to Paris, but I'm not going there to build an empire. I'm going there to learn how to enjoy the meal again." I reached into my bag and pulled out a check. It was enough to move Marco to a private hospice and pay for the best care possible for my father. "Don't thank me," I said as Marcello reached for it. "It's not a gift, it's an investment in my own peace of mind. I'm done carrying the weight of your mistakes." I walked out into the cool night air. The 7-year journey was over. I had bought the ashes just as I promised. But as I looked up at the stars, I realized that ashes don't have to be the end. They can be the fertilizer for something that grows without thorns.
The 8th year began not with a bang, but with a profound silence. Marco passed away in the early spring, just as the first ramps and wild garlic began to appear in the markets. I didn't hold a grand funeral. I honored my father's wishes for a private ceremony, and I paid for everything, but I didn't cry. I stood by the grave and felt only the closing of a heavy book. The debt was finally settled in a way that no ledger could ever record. A few months later, the Paris opening of the Elena collection was hailed as the culinary event of the decade. The critics called it transcendental. They said I had managed to capture the raw, unbridled passion of a street market and refine it into the elegance of a palace. But as I stood in the center of that beautiful Parisian kitchen, looking at the gleaming copper and the hand-picked team of chefs from all over the world, I realized I had reached the end of that particular road. I had proven everything I needed to prove. I had defeated the men who dismissed me. I had reclaimed my stolen heritage, and I had built a name that eclipsed the shadow of my father. "Julian," I said, calling him into my office overlooking the Seine. He looked at me, sensing the shift in the air. "You look different, Elena. More light." "I'm selling, Julian." He froze, a stack of contracts in his hand. "Selling? The Paris location or the London expansion?" "Everything," I said, gesturing to the city below. "The restaurants, the real estate, the shell companies, the trademarks, all of it. I want Alethea Holdings to begin the process of a management buyout. I want Maya and the other head chefs I've trained to own their own kitchens. They shouldn't have to fight for a seat at the table like I did. I'm giving them the table." "But Elena," Julian stammered. "You've built an empire. You're worth hundreds of millions. Why walk away now?" "Because an empire is just a gilded cage," I replied, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in years. "I spent 7 years fueled by spite, and another year fueled by the fear of losing what I'd won. I've been a ghost, a wolf, and a queen, but I haven't just been a woman who loves to cook in a very long time." The process took 6 months. I kept enough to ensure my father would live in comfort for the rest of his days, and enough for myself to never have to look at a price tag again. But the bulk of the Moretti wealth, the wealth built on the backs of silent workers and broken promises, was redistributed to the people who actually did the work. I made one last stop at L'Oro di Napoli in Manhattan. It was no longer called that, of course. It was simply Elena's. I walked in through the front door, not the kitchen entrance. My father was sitting at a small corner table. He spent most of his evenings there now, watching the room. He didn't interfere, he just watched with the quiet pride of a man who had finally learned the value of what he had lost. I sat down across from him. "I'm leaving tomorrow, Dad." He heard. "Julian told me you're going to a small village in the south of Italy. A farm?" "A farm and a cooking school," I said. "No Michelin stars, no critics, no lifestyle branding. Just soil, sun, and people who want to learn how to make bread that tastes like home." Marcello reached across the table and patted my hand. "You were always the best of us, Elena. Marco had the charm, and I had the ambition, but you had the truth. I'm sorry it took me a lifetime to see it." "The truth is hard to digest sometimes, Dad," I said, standing up. I kissed him on the forehead. "But it's the only thing that leaves a good aftertaste." I walked out of the restaurant, and for the first time I didn't look back to see if the sign was straight or if the windows were clean. I didn't care. It wasn't mine anymore. I moved to a small coastal town in Cilento. I bought a house with an ancient olive grove and a kitchen that opened out onto the Mediterranean. I spent my days with dirt under my fingernails and my nights with the scent of sea salt and lemon zest in the air. One evening, about a year after I moved, a young woman knocked on my door. She was holding a battered suitcase and a copy of the Times magazine with my face on the cover from 3 years ago. She looked exhausted, her hands mapped with the same silvery scars I had. "I heard the ghost chef lived here," she said, her voice trembling. "I was fired today because I told my boss his sauce was broken. He told me a woman should stay on the salads." I looked at her, and for a moment I saw a 26-year-old version of myself standing in the New York rain. I stepped aside and opened the door wide. "Come in," I said. "The stove is already hot." I didn't give her a lecture on corporate strategy. I didn't tell her how to buy debt or crush enemies. I handed her an apron and a knife. "The first thing you need to learn," I told her as we stood by the counter, "is that they can take your job, they can take your money, and they can even take your name, but they can never take your taste. That belongs to you." We started to cook. No cameras, no stars, no revenge. Just the sound of a knife against a board and the smell of something beautiful beginning to simmer. My name is Elena Moretti. I was the invisible ingredient. I was the ghost in the machine. I was the queen of the ruins. But tonight, as I taste a sauce made with lemons from my own trees, I am finally something better. I am free, and the meal is perfect.